For most of his life, John Travolta has been defined by motion. The strut, the spin, the smile that looks like it could outlast any storm. But lately, the story around him has shifted into something heavier. Less about a new role, more about a quiet retreat. The video frames it as a shock to those closest to him. At 71, Travolta started saying goodbye in ways that made friends uneasy, as if he were preparing the world for an absence. The problem is not that grief is new to him. The problem is what grief can do when it keeps arriving year after year until it changes the shape of a person from the inside. Travolta's real losses are not rumors. They are public, documented, and deeply personal. His son Jett died at 16 in January 2009 while the family was in the Bahamas, widely reported as seizure-related. Years later, Travolta would still speak of that day with a kind of helpless precision, as if time never fully moved past it. Then came the second catastrophe that redefined his private life. Kelly Preston, his wife and partner for nearly 3 decades, died in 2020 after a battle with breast cancer. Travolta announced it himself. Plain words, no performance. Just a man trying to stand upright in public while his world collapsed in private. The video takes those losses and adds a suspense layer. Claims of personal items being given away, a final message, family fear, and death hoaxes that are not random. Some of that may be narrative packaging rather than verifiable fact. Travolta has been the subject of online death hoaxes for years, something fact-checkers have repeatedly addressed. So the existence of hoaxes alone does not prove an intentional goodbye. But in this kind of storytelling, proof is not the main engine. Pattern is. And the pattern the video wants viewers to feel is simple. A man who has survived too much may start arranging his life as if he is running out of time. What makes the setup effective is the contrast. In late 2025, Travolta appeared in a high-profile Capital One holiday ad, dressed as Santa, channeling his Grease legacy with choreography and showmanship that looked effortlessly familiar. To the public, it read like resilience, like he still had fuel in the tank. But the video asks a darker question. What if that brightness is not proof he is fine, but proof he is trying to leave something behind while he still can? To understand why that question hooks so hard, the story rewinds to the beginning. John Joseph Travolta was born on February 18, 1954, in Englewood, New Jersey, the youngest of 6 children, raised in a home where money was limited but performance and music were everywhere. His mother, Helen, had a background in acting and drama, and his father worked in the tire business. Those details matter because they show what kept him alive before fame ever did. The stage is refuge, the spotlight is shelter. Before John Travolta became a headline, he was a kid inside a loud, creative house in Englewood, New Jersey, born on February 18, 1954, the youngest of 6 children, watching his mother rehearse and teach. Watching his father carry the practical weight of keeping the family steady. His father, Salvatore Sam Travolta, worked in the tire business. His mother, Helen Cecilia, had been an actress and singer and later taught drama and English, the kind of parent who didn't just tell you to dream, but showed you what dreaming looked like in real time. That detail matters because it explains the engine inside him. Travolta did not discover performance as a hobby. He absorbed it as a survival skill. When a kid feels small, whether from money pressure, school pressure, or the constant sense that the world is bigger than him, he looks for one place where he can control the light. For Travolta, that place was the stage. The video leans into the idea that music and movement became his refuge. Even if the specifics are dramatized for effect, the emotional logic holds. He grew up surrounded by performance, and it gave him a language that felt safer than ordinary conversation. Then he made the first grown-up decision of his life while still a teenager. He left school to chase the work. At 16, he moved to New York, taking whatever jobs he could, learning fast that the industry doesn't reward hope. It rewards endurance. You can hear that grind behind the milestones the transcript lists. Off-Broadway gigs, auditions, rejection. The kind of early hunger that either hardens you or breaks you. For Travolta, It did something else. It sharpened him. It forced him to build discipline around a gift that was already there. By the mid-1970s, the camera found him. Welcome Back, Kotter turned him into a face people recognized in airports, in diners, on street corners. But the real shift came when Hollywood realized he wasn't just a TV personality. He could carry a story. In The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, he met actress Diana Hyland, an early love that ended in tragedy when she died of breast cancer in March 1977. That loss is not rumor or fan theory. It is documented, and it mattered because it taught him early that fame does not protect you from grief. Then came the audition that turned pressure into destiny, Saturday Night Fever. The film did not just make Travolta famous. It turned him into a symbol of an era. It grossed hundreds of millions worldwide, and his performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, placing him among the youngest nominees in that category at the time. The video highlights the walk, and that is not a trivial detail. In star-making moments, it is often one physical signature that becomes a kind of trademark, something the world can imitate in a second. Travolta's walk became a cultural shortcut. You saw it, and you understood the character, the swagger, the yearning, the electricity. But Fever also carried something darker that the glossy disco imagery often hides. The story is about a young man trying to outrun his limits, class limits, family limits, identity limits. That theme would follow Travolta through the next explosion, Grease. Released in 1978, Grease became a box office phenomenon, ultimately reaching roughly $396 million worldwide. It turned him from a star into a permanent reference point. Danny Zuko wasn't just a role. It became a lifetime shadow, beloved, profitable, and difficult to escape. And here is the hinge the video is building toward. Even this early in the timeline, Travolta's life was being shaped by two forces at once. On one side, mass adoration, millions of people turning his work into joy, nostalgia, identity. On the other side, private grief arriving early, reminding him that applause does not equal safety. By the end of that decade, even family loss entered the picture. His mother, Helen, died in December 1978. So when a video later claims that, at 71, he began saying goodbye, it is trying to make the audience connect the dots backward. A man who learned to survive through performance, who became a global symbol of motion and charisma, but who also collected losses earlier than most people realize. The rise was real. The legend was real. And the cost, quietly, steadily, was real too. After Saturday Night Fever and Grease, the world thought John Travolta's path was locked in place. He was the face of a generation's fantasy. Youth that never gets tired, confidence that never breaks, movement that never slows. But superstardom does not come with instructions. It comes with a trap. The trap is simple. Everyone wants the same version of you forever, while you're trying to become something else before you rot inside your own legend. In the early 1980s, Travolta started learning the brutal truth of Hollywood physics. The higher you rise, the faster the fall can look, especially when the public believes they own your image. He made choices that were not always safe, not always popular, but they were choices made by someone trying to stay human. Urban Cowboy showed he could pivot into a grittier masculinity without losing the magnetism. Blowout proved he could carry paranoia, heartbreak, and moral tension. Work that critics would later point to as evidence he was always more than a dance floor icon. But the audience is not always ready for the actor you want to become. Sometimes they only want the actor they already paid for. Then came Staying Alive, the sequel that carried a symbolic weight bigger than the box office. The title alone sounded like a confession, because by then, Staying Alive was not about disco. It was about survival inside an industry that turns people into products. Travolta was still famous, still visible, still chased by cameras, but fame is not the same thing as stability. The 80s became a decade where his career looked like a fight between two versions of himself. The global heartthrob the world demanded, and the serious actor he was trying to earn. When the pendulum swung the wrong way, it swung hard. Projects underperformed. Reviews got cruel. The business side of Hollywood can be merciless because it rewrites the past in real time. One year you are a guarantee. The next year you are a risk. And the darkest part is that the decline is rarely announced with one dramatic moment. It arrives as silence. Fewer calls, smaller rooms, meetings that end too quickly, a sense that the machine has already decided you are yesterday. Travolta's story could have ended there, in that quiet professional exile where former idols get remembered but not hired. But his career never followed one straight line, and that is what makes the later goodbye framing so emotionally loaded. Because the man the world watches now is not someone who has only known victory. He is someone who has already survived being discarded. In 1989, something surprising happened. Look Who's Talking brought him back into the mainstream with a project that did not require him to be the coolest man in the room. It required him to be accessible, warm, slightly self-deprecating. It reminded audiences that he could be charming without the armor of his earlier persona. More importantly, it reminded Hollywood that he could still sell a movie. The comeback did not restore the old myth. It built a new one, Travolta as a survivor. Around this period, his private life began to anchor him in a way that fame never could. He met Kelly Preston, and the relationship grew into something the public would later see as one of the steadier long-term marriages in the celebrity world. They married in the early 1990s and eventually built a family, something that matters in this narrative because it adds stakes. When you're only responsible for yourself, the rise and fall of Hollywood feels personal. When you have a family, the industry's cruelty becomes a threat to your home, your identity, your sense of safety. Still, the defining reinvention came in 1994, one of those rare moments when the entire culture seems to flip in a single weekend. Pulp Fiction didn't just revive Travolta's career. It reintroduced him to the world as a different kind of performer. Unpredictable, darker, funnier, more dangerous. The role gave him a second life, and it was not a nostalgic second life. It was a sharp one, a modern one. It proved that the earlier version of him, the disco suit, the teen idol glow, had never been the whole story. It also proved something else, that Travolta's real gift was not dancing. It was presence, the ability to make you watch even when he does almost nothing. After Pulp Fiction, the doors open again, but now they open differently. He wasn't being offered the next Saturday Night Fever. He was being offered characters with edges. Men who smile while thinking, men who talk while hiding, men who can be charming and unsettling in the same breath. Get Shorty. Let him weaponize calm confidence. Face/off. Asked him to play with identity itself. What happens when a man's face becomes a mask, and the mask starts reshaping the soul? In these years, Travolta looked like someone determined not to be boxed in again, even if that meant taking risks that could easily backfire. And risks did backfire. That is part of the real texture of his life. Not every swing connected. Some projects drew ridicule. Some were seen as miscalculations. In the public imagination, a star is either up or down, either winning or finished. But Travolta's career has always moved like a heartbeat. Spike, dip, recover, dip again. That rhythm matters because it mirrors the emotional rhythm the video is trying to sell. A man who keeps restarting until eventually restarting begins to feel exhausting. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he was still a major name, still capable of commanding attention, still able to surprise an audience. But the goodbye framing is not really about whether he can still act. It is about what it costs to keep performing when your life keeps asking you to grieve. Because when you look at Travolta's story honestly, you see the pattern. Every time the public tried to freeze him in one image, life forced him into another. Every time he rebuilt his career, something personal demanded a different kind of strength. And that is what makes the later years feel so fragile. Not because he is weak, but because he has been strong for a very long time. There is a point in a person's life where success stops feeling like protection, where awards, money, and public love become background noise, Because the only thing that matters is whether the people you love are still breathing when you walk through the door. For John Travolta, that point arrived not on a movie set, not at a premiere, but in the most ordinary place imaginable. A family trip that was supposed to be quiet, safe, normal. By the late 2000s, Travolta had already lived several careers inside one name. He had been the disco king, the romantic lead, the washed-up star, the comeback miracle, and then, again, a respected actor with serious weight. But the role that mattered most to him in private was the one the public saw the least clearly. Father. He and Kelly Preston had built a family life that, from the outside, looked grounded compared to the chaos that follows most A-list careers. They protected what they could. They controlled what they could. They tried to keep the world from reaching too far into their home. And then, in January 2009, their son Jett died while the family was in the Bahamas. Public reporting at the time widely described it as seizure-related. What is important for the HHW_2 lens is not the clinical detail. It is the emotional architecture of what follows a loss like that. Because losing a child does not simply break your heart. It changes how you interpret every future moment. It turns ordinary silence into a threat. It makes joy feel suspicious, like something that could be taken away the second you start trusting it. The transcript you shared includes one of the most painful themes often repeated in stories about that period. The idea that Travolta attempted CPR, pleading for his son to breathe. Whether or not every word is dramatized, the central truth remains. He was forced into the kind of helplessness that fame cannot purchase an escape from. No role prepares you for that. No level of success rewrites the laws of grief. And grief does not arrive alone. It attracts noise. In the months after Jett's death, the family faced legal and tabloid turbulence. Accusations, rumors, opportunists, and lawsuits orbiting around the tragedy. One particularly notorious episode involved an extortion case connected to alleged attempts to obtain money from the family using documents related to Jett's death. Even when those matters are resolved in courtrooms, the emotional cost does not resolve so neatly. A courtroom is a public stage where private pain is forced in a language that feels cold and procedural. It is one thing to mourn. It is another thing to mourn while strangers argue about your grief like a transaction. This is the part of Travolta's story that rarely fits into the clean Hollywood biography arc. Most celebrity narratives depend on the idea that hardship is a chapter you overcome and then move on from. But child loss does not behave like that. It stays. It changes the temperature of your whole life. And the transcript hints at the kind of transformation that is difficult to explain to people who have not lived it. After a tragedy like that, a person can still smile, can still work, can still perform, but something inside becomes more cautious, more fragile, more aware of endings. In the years that followed, there were visible attempts at healing. In 2010, Travolta and Preston welcomed their son Benjamin. In public, the arrival was often framed as a light after darkness. And it was. But even light after darkness does not erase what came before. It simply teaches you a different way to carry it. Many people who endure that kind of loss become intensely protective, intensely present, and intensely afraid of the future, because the future has already proven it can be cruel without warning. Travolta also leaned into service and visibility in ways that looked, from the outside, like resilience. He continued working. He took projects that kept him connected to audiences. He appeared in roles that reminded the world of his range, including his portrayal of Robert Shapiro in The People vs. O.J. Simpson, which brought him renewed critical recognition. Professionally, it was another reinvention. Emotionally, it looked like the pattern of a man refusing to let grief steal the only language he has ever trusted, performance. But the story was not done taking from him. In 2020, Kelly Preston died after a battle with breast cancer. She was 57. Travolta shared the news publicly, and the tone was striking. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just direct, broken honesty. He wrote about her courage and thanked the medical team. and he asked people to respect the family's privacy. It read like a man who had learned the limits of words, because he had already been forced to speak the unspeakable once before. This loss was different from Jett's, but in some ways it reopened the same wound. The feeling that the home you built can be dismantled by forces you cannot control. The video you shared frames Kelly's death as the moment that changed something inside him. That's believable, not because it makes a good story, but because when grief repeats, it reshapes identity. One loss can be a tragedy. Repeated losses can start to feel like a pattern the mind cannot stop scanning for. And this is where the goodbye motif becomes psychologically persuasive. The transcript claims that in 2025, he began giving away personal items, recording a final message, and acting in ways that worried the people around him. Those specific claims should be handled carefully in any HHW_2 script because they are difficult to verify as factual events. But the underlying emotional idea that a man who has lost his child and his wife might start to live with a heightened awareness of endings is not far-fetched. Even without the dramatic extras, the question still holds. What happens to a person when the two people who anchored his private life are gone? What makes the narrative sharper is the contrast between public brightness and private weight. In late 2025, Travolta appeared in a high-profile holiday commercial, Dancing Again, Santa on a set full of movement, nostalgia, and spectacle. Viewers saw the familiar spark and wanted to believe it meant he was back, that he was fine, that the story still had the comforting arc of resilience. But the HHW_2 lens asks something darker. What if that performance is not proof that he is untouched, but proof that he is choosing to leave the audience with something warm, because he knows what absence feels like? This is the turning point for Part 4. Not he is saying goodbye as a confirmed fact, but he has reasons to think about goodbye more than most. The transcript mentions death hoaxes, those periodic online waves where false reports of celebrity death spread and then get debunked. For most people, death hoaxes are internet noise. But for someone who has already been forced to stare down real death inside his own family, those hoaxes could land differently. Not as a joke, as a reminder, as a rehearsal the world keeps trying to perform around you. And that is where the story becomes urgent. Because if Travolta's life has taught him anything, it is that the world can change in one phone call. One moment, you are a father on vacation. The next moment, your future is split into before and after. One moment, you're a husband with plans. The next moment, you're learning how to raise a child with an empty space beside you at the table. There's a specific kind of quiet that arrives in a person's life when ambition is no longer the loudest voice in the house. Not because the person has failed, not because they have nothing left to give, but because they have already learned what the world rarely teaches in time. The future is not guaranteed, and legacy is not something you talk about at the end. Legacy is something you build while you still have breath, while you can still choose what the world will remember you for. That is the emotional territory the video tries to place John Travolta inside. Not a man collapsing in public, not a man begging for attention, but a man moving differently, simplifying, recentering, stripping life down to what still feels real. After Kelly Preston died in 2020, Travolta became the kind of public figure people watch with a special sensitivity. Fans do not just see the actor anymore. They see a widower raising children, a father who has already buried a son, a man who keeps showing up even when the reasons to stay quiet are strong. And when the public sees someone carrying that much grief, they start interpreting small choices like they are signals. One post, one disappearance, one photo that looks like a farewell, one gesture that seems too sentimental to be casual. That is how the goodbye narrative grows. It does not require a confirmed announcement. It only requires pattern, and the human mind is built to search for patterns, especially when the person in front of us is someone we feel we have known for decades. The video claims that in 2025, something changed inside him. It describes him giving away personal items that meant everything, recording what it calls a final message, and worrying his family. Those specifics are difficult to verify from the outside, and in this story, they function more like symbolism than proof. But the deeper idea beneath those claims is worth taking seriously. Grief can turn a person into an archivist of their own life. Not because they want to disappear, but because they want control over the narrative that will remain when they're no longer there to correct it. And Travolta has reason to care about narrative control. He has lived through eras where Hollywood praised him, abandoned him, revived him, and then tried to rewrite him again. He has been reduced to stereotypes more times than most actors survive. Disco icon, heartthrob, washed up, comeback king. Even his mistakes have been treated like permanent identity. That kind of public reduction forces a private decision. Either you let the world tell your story, or you begin telling it yourself in quieter ways. In late life, those quieter ways often look like ordinary decisions, but they carry emotional weight. Downsizing, sorting possessions, giving meaningful objects to people who matter. Recording messages not for publicity, but for continuity. Planning so your children are protected. Creating a paper trail so opportunists cannot weaponize confusion later. None of this is dramatic when you describe it clinically, but it becomes dramatic when you place it in the context of a man who has already learned how suddenly life can take everything away. And then there is the strange modern phenomenon the video leans on: death hoaxes. Online, a celebrity can be declared gone in a trending post before breakfast and alive again by lunch, as if human life were just another rumor cycle. For most people, it is annoying noise. For someone who has lived real death close to the skin, who has received real phone calls, attended real funerals, held real grief inside a home, those hoaxes can land like a cruel echo. Even if he shrugs them off publicly, the repetition can still do something privately. It can force you to imagine your own disappearance again and again, until you begin thinking less about how to live loudly and more about how to leave cleanly. Leaving cleanly does not mean leaving soon. It means leaving without chaos. And Travolta has seen chaos, not just in tabloids, but in the way tragedy attracts people who want something from it. He has experienced what happens when private pain becomes public material. So if he were to prepare anything, messages, arrangements, boundaries, it would not necessarily be a sign of fear. It could be a sign of experience. This is where the video's suspense line, there's something he's not telling us, becomes effective because it activates the viewer's imagination. But what could a man like Travolta realistically be not telling the public? The answer does not need to be a dark secret to be heartbreaking. Sometimes the heartbreaking truth is simpler. He may be tired. Not tired of acting, not tired of fans, not tired of life, but tired of how much of life he has had to survive. That kind of tiredness changes behavior. It changes what feels important. A younger Travolta had to chase the next role to prove he could outgrow the last one. An older Travolta does not need to prove anything. He already has icons behind him. He already has a career that can't be erased. So the question becomes less what's next and more what stays. What stays for his children? What stays for the fans? What stays for the version of himself that was once a kid in a small house, watching his mother rehearse, try to turn pain into performance? If you look at him through that lens, even the public appearances people call nostalgia can take on a different meaning. Nostalgia is not always a commercial strategy. Sometimes nostalgia is a form of grief management, a way of revisiting a time when life felt simpler, when loss had not yet stacked up, a way of borrowing warmth from memory, because present-day warmth requires too much effort. So when people say he's saying goodbye, the responsible way to interpret it is not he is leaving. It is he is recalibrating. He is shifting from a life driven by reinvention into a life driven by preservation. He is deciding what parts of himself will remain accessible to the world and what parts he will keep private forever. And if he did record any message, whether the video's claim is literal or metaphorical, the most likely truth is that it would not be a sensational confession. It would be a statement of gratitude, a closing of the loop. The kind of message a man writes when he realizes he has been loved by strangers for decades, and that kind of love is rare enough to deserve an answer. The most dangerous thing about modern fame is not criticism. It is narration. The internet narrates you in real time, even when you are silent. A pause becomes a clue. A private decision becomes a sign. A normal post becomes a forecast. And once the story takes off, people do not ask, is it true? They ask, what does it mean? That is the atmosphere this video is built inside. The idea that John Travolta is saying goodbye, not with a press conference, but with small, worrying signals that only make sense after you connect them backwards. Start with the noise. Travolta has been a repeated target of celebrity death hoaxes online, and fact-checkers have addressed the pattern directly. These hoaxes are not evidence of a real farewell. They are evidence of how easily the public turns a living person into a rumor. But here is why the hoax angle matters for the HHW_2 narrative. A death hoax forces a man to watch strangers practice his absence, again and again. For someone who has already buried the people closest to him, that practice is not funny. It is a kind of psychological abrasion, small on the surface, but sharp when it keeps repeating. Then comes the second layer, visibility that looks like performance, but might be something else. Late in 2025, Travolta appeared as Santa in a Capital One holiday commercial, revisiting Greece, energy, dancing, singing, and leaning into the warmth audiences associate with him. Entertainment press framed it as nostalgic joy, a proof-of-life moment that reminded people he can still command a set. In isolation, that is just an ad. In the logic of the video, it becomes a contrast tool. The public sees brightness, while the narration insists there is darkness off camera. And here is where the final message, claim, becomes persuasive even without hard proof. People rarely announce the deepest parts of grief directly. They encode it. They choose a song that says what they cannot say. They post on a day that matters. They speak to fans not as an audience, but as witnesses. Travolta's public statements about Kelly Preston's death in 2020 were not theatrical. He simply told the truth. She had lost a 2-year battle with breast cancer, and he was devastated. That tone, the plain, heavy clarity, taught the public what his serious voice sounds like. So when fans later see a sentimental post or a reflective appearance, some of them interpret it as another version of that serious voice, even if it is not intended that way. But the private reality behind the public interpretation is far more important than the rumor itself. Travolta's life contains 2 losses that permanently change how a person relates to time. His son Jett died at age 16 in the Bahamas in January 2009, reported as seizure-related. Kelly Preston died in 2020. Those facts alone make the goodbye narrative emotionally believable to viewers, because people assume repeated loss produces an expectation of another loss. What the video does is take that expectation and aim it at the present tense. It suggests he is giving away meaningful personal items and recording something like a last statement. Unless you have independent confirmation, those details should be treated as story framing, not established fact. The smarter HHW_2 move is to present them as what they function as, a fear the public projects onto him, because the public does not know how to sit with a living person who has survived that much grief. And here's the most plausible final message that does exist in plain sight, one that is less sensational, but more heartbreaking. The message he is delivering to his youngest child. After Kelly died, Travolta spoke about having a candid conversation with his son Ben about death, how his child worried about losing his father too, and how Travolta tried to reassure him while still being honest about life's uncertainty. That is the real farewell pressure point. Not a tape for fans. Not a dramatic confession. A father realizing his child is scanning the world for the next funeral. If you want the emotional core of Part 6, it is this. After repeated trauma, people do not fear death in the abstract. They fear what death does to the people left behind. Travolta has already watched grief change his family's shape. So if he ever prepares anything, messages, arrangements, boundaries, it may not be a sign that he is leaving soon. It may be a sign that he refuses to let his children inherit chaos. That is why the final message angle keeps working on audiences. Because everyone understands on some level what it means to want a clean exit, not as surrender, but as protection. And in Travolta's case, the protection is not about his image. It is about the children who still have to wake up in the house after the headlines move on. If you strip away the internet noise, the theories, the dramatic phrasing, what remains is simpler and more unsettling. John Travolta is not a mystery because he is hiding a scandal. He is a mystery because grief has made him private in a world that demands constant access. People want a clear ending, a final statement, a clean explanation. But the truth is that life rarely gives clean explanations, especially to someone who has already been forced to keep walking after losses most people cannot imagine. This is why the goodbye narrative keeps attaching itself to him. When the public watches a person survive repeated tragedy, they start searching for signs that the survivor is about to collapse. They read meaning into small choices. They hear a final message in a normal tribute. They interpret nostalgia as an exit plan. And even when those interpretations are wrong, they reveal something real about the audience. People are afraid of watching someone carry pain without an obvious resolution. But Travolta's story has never been about resolution. It has been about endurance. He has already lived through the most brutal kind of before and after. He has already learned that the world can change in one moment, and that no amount of fame can negotiate with death. That kind of knowledge does not always create despair. Sometimes it creates precision. It makes a person decide what matters and what is not. It narrows life down to the essentials: family, time, memory, and the quiet responsibility of staying present. So if he seems to be saying goodbye in small ways, the more responsible interpretation is that he may be changing the way he belongs to the world. Not disappearing, redefining. Choosing privacy over performance more often. Choosing meaning over noise. Choosing to protect what he still has, instead of proving, again, that he can survive what he already survived. And that shift can look frightening to outsiders, because audiences are used to celebrities performing certainty. When a star stops performing certainty, people assume something is wrong. But for someone like Travolta, certainty is the one thing life has repeatedly refused to give. What he can offer instead is something quieter: continuity. A steady presence for his children. A steady gratitude toward the people who loved him through every reinvention. A steady acknowledgement that joy is not the opposite of grief. It is what you build beside it. The heartbreak of this story is not that a legend might be preparing to leave. The heartbreak is that a legend is learning how to live with the reality that leaving is always possible for anyone at any time. And when you truly absorb that reality, you do not always become dramatic. Sometimes you become careful. Sometimes you become still. So the final note is not a conclusion. It is a question, a human one, not a tabloid one. If a man has already lost the people who made his life feel anchored, what does he owe the world now? Another performance to reassure strangers? Or the right to live quietly, to protect what remains, and to let goodbye mean not an ending but a different way of breathing?